Peace and love. Welcome again to U.S. Political Prisoners and You, brought to you on Black Power Media. I am Brother Frank, and I'm with my guest today, my brother Caesar. He's going to give you his introduction in 1 second. I just want to speak first briefly. Today is April 1st. It is Jazz Appreciation Month, and we recognize those greats, people like Max Rose, people like John Coltrane, people like Nina Simone, who took a very definitive position when it came to their art. They wanted to make sure that they let people know about the power of jazz, the power that they had. So, my brother, please introduce yourself, and so we can start this most important, this important discussion on the Cuban Five.
Well, first of all, I say thank you so much for having me on. It's great that we're having this very important dialogue and discussion, especially in a time when Cuba is under attack, and they've been under attack since 1959, the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. I'm actually one of the five co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba. I encourage your listeners and your viewers to go to nnoc.org where people can get more information on Cuba and how to get involved, how to travel to Cuba, and to stand in solidarity with Cuba. We have numerous projects we're working on. We work with numerous organizations, over 60 organizations throughout the United States, even our brothers in, our brothers and comrades in Canada as well.
All right, thank you. Before we go into the questions that I have assigned for you, I just want to brief people on the Cuban Five because I'm also learning more about the Cuban Five, also called the Miami Five, and I wanted to learn more about them. So I had went online to get an article about them, and I'm just going to read that article briefly before I ask you these questions, so our viewers have an overall view about the Cuban Five. So this came from the Militant, and it's on an anniversary of their release, their 10-year anniversary release. It says on December 17th, working people in Cuba marked the 10th anniversary of the victory in the battle to win the release of the Cuban Five. That's how five Cuban revolutionaries arrested and railroaded to jail in the United States in 1998 have become known worldwide. Gerardo Hernandez, Ramon Labanino, and Antonio Guerrero, the three remaining behind bars in the U.S., returned to their homeland that day in 2014, reunited with their two brothers in struggle, Rene Gonzalez and Fernando Gonzalez, who had returned to Cuba after serving their prison term. It was a great moment for all those around the world who had fought for the previous 16 years to win their freedom. Across the islands, Cubans poured into the streets from factories, schools, and offices to express their joy. Supporters around the world joined in celebration. Our return was like a chess game that only a revolution like ours can play, one that has the pride of having faced the biggest empire in the world and has not kneeled down before it, said Hernandez at a December 17th gathering this year in Havana, attended by the five Cuban leader Raul Castro and President Miguel Diaz Canel to mark the victory. The five were arrested in pre-dawn FBI raid in Florida under the direction of the Bill Clinton administration on frame-up charges of espionage. But they had no evidence to convict them on this, so Clinton's Justice Department resorted to trumped up conspiracy charges, and in the case of Hernandez, conspiracy to commit murder. In fact, the five had come to the U.S. to gather information on paramilitary forces in southern Florida with a long history of violent attacks on Cuba and against supporters of the Cuban Revolution in Puerto Rico and the United States. Five reinforced U.S. workers' fights. The Five's revolutionary record and their conduct in the trial and in prison won them respect and admiration among workers inside and outside prison walls. They rejected both threats and entitlements made by government agents and prosecutors trying to convince them to cop a plea to crimes they never committed. Their five, their fight helped shine a spotlight on the class character of capitalist justice experienced firsthand by millions of working people in the United States, from the brutality of cops and prison guards to denial of trial by a jury of your peers and any semblance of presumption of innocence. Labanino appropriately described it as an enormous machine for grinding people up. Over the years in prison, the five learned about the class struggle in the United States. We lived in the microcosm of the outside world, said Hernandez in an interview published in the book. It's the poor who face the savagery of the U.S. justice system, one of a number of publications put out by Pathfinder Press as part of for the fight for their freedom. Their jailmates learned about Cuba's socialist revolution and its internationalist example. Three of the Cuban Five were among the 425,000 Cuban volunteers who went to Angola to defend that country against an invasion by South Africa. The blows dealt to the hated apartheid regime helped free Nelson Mandela and end his rule. From the beginning of the fight for the Five's release, the militant helped week in and week out to get out the truth about the defense campaign and about Cuba's socialist revolution. Members of the Socialist Workers' Party helped organize events and art exhibitions in community centers, libraries, union halls, and elsewhere, explaining who they were and what they stood for. Your unwavering strength, dignity, honesty, creativity, and humor have shown the world what it means to be a revolutionary, what it means to be a communist. Socialist Workers Party National Secretary Jack Barnes wrote to the Cuban Five and to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Cuba upon their release. Ours was a fight in defense of Cuba. It was always clear to us that the fight for justice in our case was a fight in defense of Cuba, wrote Rene Gonzalez in September 2012. It was simply an extension of the confrontation between those who claim the prerogative to attack Cuba and those of us who believe in Cuba's right to defend itself. In 2014, recognizing the failure of 11 previous U.S. administrations to make the Cuban people submit to Washington's dictate through economic strangulation, the Barack Obama administration said it would turn to different methods to topple Cuba's socialist revolution. As part of this shift, Obama agreed to the release of the Five in exchange for Cuba's release of U.S. agents. Obama decided to decided he could press Washington's moves against Cuba best by reestablishing diplomatic relations between the two countries and to ease some of its economic pressure. This in no way means that the heart of the matter has been solved, Cuban President Raul Castro and said December 17, 2014, as the three Cuban revolutionaries returned to Cuba. The economic, commercial, and financial blockade, which causes enormous human and economic damages to our country, must cease. When Obama's different methods failed to make a dent in the support of the Cuban people for their socialist revolution, Washington moved to resume deepen its economic war on them. Over the next decade, Donald Trump's White House imposed some of the most draconian economic and political measures yet taken against the Cuban people, and Joseph Biden's administration has maintained them. Upon their return, the Cuban Five spoke to audiences across the island, sharing their experiences. Everything that happened is not about us as individuals, Guerrero said at a 2015 presentation to young university students in Havana on Absolved by Solidarity, another book published by Pathfinder. It's the Cuban people who we represent. The standing we gain represents the resistance of our people. In carrying out their work, none of the five heroes sought applause, rewards, or fame. Cuban leader Fidel Castro told the press March 1st, 2015, after meeting with them. They received their distinctions because they didn't seek them. A week earlier, the five had been awarded the distinction of being heroes of the Republic of Cuba. Today, all five have taken on leadership roles and working to advance Cuba's socialist revolution. I know that was lengthy, but I thought it was appropriate because I needed to understand for myself and for those viewers that this uh, story needs to be explained in its entirety, and then we could see the relationship that it has to what's going on currently. So my first question was, when did you first hear about the Cuban Five, Miami Five, and what impact did it have on you?
Well, I think it's very important that that you did talk about it. You give us more context and a broader understanding of who the Cuban Five was. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, there's so much to talk about Cuba, but I mean, I'm going to try to keep my answers to your questions very concise for your audience. Um, I guess when I first learned about the Cuban Five, at a time when I was beginning to more deeply understand the realities of the U.S.-Cuban relations, and of course the broader history of the political struggle in Latin America. Um, what struck me was not only the injustice of their imprisonment, but the silence, surrounding the case in the mainstream narratives. Now we all know how mainstream is. We're living in a time when everything is pretty much censored. It's fake in many ways. It's not real. It's non-reality. It's more fictional than reality. But these individuals who acted to prevent violence from paramilitary death squads in Miami, supported by the U.S. government, but yet they themselves, the Cuban Five, were treated as criminals rather than defending of their people. In this case, Cuba, to protect sovereign nations of Cuba. Learning their history, their story was had a huge, profound impact on me. It really did. It challenged me, and to question justice and how justice is defined, who gets to shape the definition. More importantly, it awakens a deeper sense of responsibility to seek truth beyond what is really presented, you know, and to stand in solidarity, for those who are injustice targeted for the political beliefs or actions. So, I think it's important that when we stand in solidarity with revolutionaries like the Cuban Five, we have to understand what they're coming from. So in this case, I took upon myself and I reached out to numerous organizations, and ever since then we built this huge campaign. And of course, as you mentioned in your beginning of this discussion, and how they were released, and that's because of my commitment, our commitment, collectivism, and solidarity for Cuba.
Thank you. When I was reading the article, it talked about the prerogative. It used the term prerogative, and I thought that that's a word that we really have to dig deeper into, because when we look at the attacks on a people's right to self determination, then they determine who your heroes should be. They determine that you don't have no political prisoners, that these people are criminals and terrorists, and they need to be dealt with accordingly. So that was one of the powerful things that I seen in that article. And then when you talking about your organizing, and in an article they talked about using community centers, using union halls. So whatever the people had access, who wanted them free, had access to, they made sure that they used it to raise the awareness about them. So that was very important that I was able to read that, because it let me know how those lessons can be utilized today to free our captured freedom fighters, our political prisoners. So which leads me to my next question, which is, what lessons can we learn from the Cuban Five, aka the Miami Five?
Yes. Well, I will call them the Revolutionary Five, in my opinion. And they are always
Absolutely.
be remembered as the Revolutionary Cuban Five. The Cuban Five, what I've learned, was the unwavering commitment, the dignity, the collective responsibility, despite the long years of harsh imprisonment, their conditions. They never abandoned their principles. I'm going to just re-emphasize that. They never abandoned the principles or the sense of purpose. There's been case there. I've heard that the government has really pressured each individual of the five to turn on one another, to turn against each other, so they can reduce their sentence time. But they did not. They did not. They stuck together, despite despite the consequences. Despite the possibility they might be in jail for the rest of their life, because with the U.S. empire, you don't know what could happen. Of course, the other key lesson is the power of solidarity. Their eventual freedom was not an accident. It was the result of the sustained international pressure, the grassroots organizations, which I did mention earlier, and of course, people across the world refusing to forget for what they fought for what they continue to fight for. This shows us that organized collectivism, collective action, can challenge even the most entrenched system of power. In this case, the U.S. empire, the capitalist system that we're all living under. Finally, uh, the Cuban Five teaches us the importance of moral clarity. They acted not out of self-interest, but out of commitment to protect lives. that kind of clarity, knowing what we struggle, who we struggle for, is essential in any movement for justice. Um, and when you come across an empire that is only 90 miles away, away from the coast of Cuba, I mean, the Cuban Five, they knew exactly what they were up against, and I mean, unfortunately, they did pay a price, but at the end, they came out victoriously because of their commitment, our commitment, the international commitment of standing in solidarity with Cuba.
Their example, as you said, to stay steadfast throughout these harsh conditions, allowed me to understand the importance and the power of the Cuban Revolution. They obviously had political education. You had some of them actually fought in Angola, and so they had a history of understanding what their role is in the Cuban Revolution. And I think that that is very important that we continue to get empowered by our history, a knowledge of our history, and utilize it in our current time. We have to take these lessons and apply them to what's going on, because this is a marathon. It's not a sprint, and you have to pace yourself. And the enemy's attacking 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and you have to make an assessment of what's working for you and what's working against you, and you need to stand on the side that's working with you, and you have to do that definitively. Uh, so my next question is, what responsibility do we have to the Revolutionary Five and former and current political prisoners in the United States?
Well, it's our responsibility first and foremost is that we have to remember to educate our friends, our families, our comrades. We must, we must not ensure that their stories are not erased or distorted from history, that future generations understand both the injustice they faced and the principles they stood for. Beyond that, we have a responsibility to continue to work, to continue to build solidarity, um, you know, not end when individuals are freed. We have to keep on consistency to extend to all those who remain in prison for political reasons today. I mean, I'll just give you one comrade who's still in prison, Mumia Abu Jamal. I mean, that's just one perfect example out of many. Just recently, Leonard Peltier was just released. But again, this is something that we have to continue to educate, continue to fight. Saying that means advocating and organizing, raising awareness, challenging the system that produces political prisoners in the first place. It's not. I mean, let's not forget we do live in a system that incarcerates more black people than any other country in the world. That is a fact. You know, and then of course we look at Latinos and indigenous and brown people. That goes second. And it's just that we live in a we live in a police state. And we have been living in a police state for quite some time now. We also owe the Cuban Five consistency. We owe people who are being oppressed. We owe them consistency. It is not enough to just to speak about the injustice. We have to be visible. We have to remain committed, even when the spotlight fades. Even when we know that things might get a little bit too difficult. We have to honor their sacrifice, embody the same courage, discipline, and the sense of collective responsibility in our actions. And of course, I just want to last thing too is ultimately our responsibility is to ensure that their struggle was not in vain, that it contributes to build a more just, a more conscious, organized movement capable of confronting just injustice wherever it exists. So whether it's Cuba, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Sudan or Congo, we have an obligation, a responsibility, because we live in the belly of the beast. So we have a responsibility to continue to fight, to continue to build solidarity, not only domestically but internationally. And Cuba is the beacon of hope because Cuba has not only shown the world what a possible system, a world that we can work collectively you know, um, is possible. And of course, the U.S. empire fear that, and that's the only reason. That's one of the reasons why they want to destroy Cuba. So with that, I say that it's not going to happen as long as we are committed, as long as we have love and compassion and that same revolutionary spirit from all our past ancestors. We will continue this fight for Cuba.
Absolutely. That was my last question that I had, and I just want to spend the remainder of this time to just go back and forth on our reflections on Cuba, and it's important to struggle everywhere, right? Because it's been the model of what's possible, right? I know that when I first went to Cuba, I went to the Fidel Castro Museum. I went to the museum on the CIA. I went to a number of places, and I seen a number of things that really raised my consciousness about Cuba and my relationship to it and the importance of it and why I need to be more active in it. And it allowed me to dig deeper into Cuba and continue to study more. I know I had purchased a book when I first went to Cuba, and it's called An American History Cuba by I Ada Fiera. I thought the book was very interesting. It brought about certain things that I did not know, and but it allowed me to appreciate my time there, my visit there, and I would encourage others to see things for themselves because a lot of times people are misled by what they just see on YouTube. It's nothing like having a firsthand experience. And me having that firsthand experience allowed me to understand that this is a place that needs to be advocated for. This is a place that needs solidarity over sympathy. A lot of times people will like, share something, and throw a hashtag out there and think that that's enough. But you know, we have to do more. We have to make phone calls. We have to go to programs. We have to make donations. We have to encourage people that we know to make no donations. I know that one of the things that I did with my family is that when Jalil Abdul Muta King came home, a number of us were responsible for collecting money for him, and you know, I was able to raise some money amongst my family, and that surprised me. I didn't think that they was going to do that, but I was consistent with talking about political prisons. I was consistent with his story, and my consistency won them over. So that's a reflection that I have.
Yes.
What was your first time going to Cuba, and what motivated you to do the current work that you're doing?
Well, I think it was in the early, I don't recall, but it was actually in the early 2006 or 7 when I went to Cuba for the first time. Um, you know, and when you go to Cuba, you have to say it. So you have to see it firsthand what this blockade has done to Cuba. But yet, despite the blockade, despite the difficulty, you see the resilience. You see how people are very committed. They look out for one another, and to me, that has been very inspiring and heartbreaking as well because we are in many ways culpable because we allow this blockade to happen. So when I came back to Cuba, my commitment to my comrades and friends, and now they have become families to me, um, was that we will continue to organize here in the states to continue to fight, and that would inspire me, by the Cubans, you know, and inspired others to work collectively. And to this very day, we're still fighting. And that's one of the reasons why I became one of the 5 co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba. And we work with numerous organizations who are also committed, who has been to Cuba. And I encourage yourself, my dear brother, to talk to others, to encourage your listeners and your viewers to go to Cuba. Again, you can go to nnoc.org if you want to partake. We have a brigade that's going to be leaving. I think the application might be still open, but we have a brigade that's going to be going at the end of August for the 100-year centennial of Fidel Castro, his birthday. So I encourage people to go to Cuba, see it firsthand. What the Cuban people has to endure under this vicious blockade and uncalled for, inhumane, genocidal. If I want to put it uh, bluntly.
Yes, yes. I appreciate your work, and I appreciate your consistency with that work because that's what's important. Is that we can build that camaraderie up, and it's a morale boost when they see somebody doing something for a long term, such as yourself. And I appreciate that. I want to talk about certain books that's available on Cuba that you would recommend to people. I know that I had when I went to Cuba. No, matter of fact, my wife had sent me a book from somebody else who was visiting Cuba, and they was coming back to the States. So she had them mail me the book, and the book was reminiscent of the Cuban Revolution, and it's written by Che Guevara. And this book I thought was is very powerful because it didn't. It was very practical and in telling the story of the Cuban Revolution and saying that they made mistakes, and it let me know that they were trying things. Certain things didn't work, then they had to make corrections, but it let me know that they were just like me and you, trying to figure things out, and they were comfortable with confronting the uncomfortable situation. So that was one of my favorite books, along with the book that I just showed you. And I have a number of other books, but these books raise my consciousness. And one of the things that I do is I try to give people books that they need to have access to. And if you don't have access to the book, you should have a library card and ask for that book, borrow it, read it, discuss it with your family, your colleagues, and discuss it online and continue to have that dialogue.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, and there's a lot of books out there. I mean, I could go a list. There's a lot of books out there, a lot of great information. But one book that does come in mind is actually from Martin Garbus. Now, he is a very, very well-known trial lawyer, um, very legendary in many ways. He was actually, if I'm not mistaken, he represented uh, people like Nelson Mandela, the Pentagon whistleblower of Daniel Ellsberg. But he wrote this fantastic book. It's called North of Havana: The Dirty Story of Dirty Politics, Secret Diplomacy, and the Trial of the Cuban Five. And the book really kind of gives you a broader scope, not only the case of the Cuban Five, but the politics of the U.S. government infiltration and how they tried to impose these draconian laws, these paramilitary death squads, both Democrats and Republicans, because this is all bipartisanship system. That imposes these sanctions on Cuba. But Martin Garbus, again, it's called North of Havana. I really encourage you to get that book. It's not a heavy read. I believe it's only about roughly about 230 pages. It's a very good book. It's very comprehensive. I really encourage people to pick up a copy of that book. Again, I mean, there's so many books out there I could go on, but that one actually sticks out the most, and only because as a trial lawyer, he kind of breaks down the systemic problem and all these draconian laws that systematically has been implemented to choke and asphyxiate the Cuban people. I cannot stress this enough. This is not an embargo. I know with that word embargo gets tossed around too much. This is not an embargo. This is a blockade, a genocidal blockade. I myself, that came back from Cuba, I'm seeing it firsthand of what this blockade has done. The blackouts, the fuel shortages, and of course access to products they can't bring in because of the blockade. Um, but again, Martin Garbus, North of Havana, definitely check out that book. It's very an eye opener.
Yes, I appreciate that. I want to, you mentioned the word blockade and you mentioned the and word embargo, and so you're saying that the word blockade is different from embargo, and does the blockade like does it mean it's more vicious than an embargo?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because we have a scholar professor. She has her own podcast called Cuba Analysis. Her name is Helen Jaffe, and she wrote a very interesting article. I believe she was posted on the Jacobin or Counterpunch, I believe, but it was in where she breaks down the embargo versus the blockade. Embargo is mostly, I guess, and I do apologize, Helen Yaffe, if you're listening to this or you happen to come across this video. I don't want to butcher her words, but when you look at the embargo, it's just mostly policies under kind of like this disguise of saying that we can't trade with Cuba because of the such and such bad politics and countries like Cuba who's been under sanctions, we cannot trade with them. Whereas the blockade is more of a militaristic, weaponizing the bank system, weaponizing, pressuring all these other countries not to do business with Cuba because if not, they themselves will be sanctions. So it's really kind of like more like a mafia state way of thinking, where it's like, let's just say, Frank, and me and you, we want to do business, but yet you have some other one, a power entity telling you, well, Frank, if you do business with Cesar, well, we, we might just have to shut down your podcast. I mean, think about that. I mean, that's pretty much a blockade. So then you're reluctant to work with me because of our relationship with the other power entity. In this case, Cuba versus the United States. I hope that's not a very convoluted answer, but I mean, definitely check it out. I can send you the link and the information later so you can show it to your viewers. It's from Helen Yaffe. She just kind of break it down, embargo versus blockade. Whereas the blockade, you have all these huge mechanisms. So.
I appreciate your time and I appreciate your work, and I'm looking forward to just connecting resources and letting you know where I'm at when I'm in Cuba, and introducing you to my wife and my family in Cuba, and interested in just us helping each other out where we can, and just keep each other inspired. So thank you for your time and continue to do your work. We always end this by saying, "What's the call? What's the call?"
Oh well, it's Cuba si bloqueo no, and the blockade.
Yes. And we also say, what's the call? Free them all. All right, my brother.
All right, my brother. Well, thank you for having me on, man.
I appreciate your time. I know the value of it. Safe travels.
Thanks, brother.